Well, when I was doing my research and writing on Holland, I realized that 2014-2015 was the 250th anniversary of the start of his great survey. And I wondered if it would be recognized in Canada. So all kudos to the organizing committee for putting together what must be the first event in the country to recognize Samuel Holland's enormous achievement. I'd particularly like to thank Ed for his very kind and generous comments. As he mentioned, we've known each other for many, many years. I brought some American faculty up here when I was very young, and Ed was a most gracious host and showed us around the town and gave us pointers to what to see on the island. I'd also like to thank David Kinleyside and other members of the committee for their very kind invitation for me to come here tonight to speak, and to Penny Walsh Maguire for her most efficient organisation of my visit. I also must recognise, as Ed has just done, His Honour Lieutenant Governor Frank Lewis for his patronage of this event and for the kind invitation to lunch at Fanning Bank yesterday. Island hospitality has been truly memorable, so thank you all. I'm not going to present a formal address tonight, but rather talk through a series of slides that will give you, I hope, some sense of the larger context of Samuel Holland's great surveying venture 250 years ago. I will, of course, say something about his work on the island. How could I not, as the survey started not far from here? But I do want to enlarge your view and place the island in its larger geographic, scientific, and imperial context. I also want to say something about the great series of maps that resulted from the surveys. Many of them were engraved and published in the 4-volume maritime chart collection known as the Atlantic Neptune, a publication produced by J.F.W. de Barr, who you all know as a former governor of this island. So we have in the title here, of course, 2 connections to Prince Edward Island. In many ways, the surveys begun by Samuel Holland 250 years ago were a great scientific achievement and deserve to be much better known. But they have been overshadowed, essentially by 2 events. The voyages of James Cook in the Pacific in the late 1760s and the early 1770s, which had an enormous impact on European Enlightenment thought. And then, of course, that rather unfortunate event, the outbreak of the American Revolution in 1775, which brought the great survey to a dramatic conclusion. So this 250th commemoration helps highlight the work that Samuel Holland did, and I hope brings it to a much wider public. Certainly the surveys are important. They represent the first systematic scientific mapping on a large scale of part of the North American continent. The story begins here on this island. The surveys comprised several types of surveying. They comprised maritime, or what we would now call hydrographic surveys. They comprised cadastral surveys, which are land surveys, and also geodetic surveys, which is the way that these other surveys are put into a larger grid of latitude and longitude that encompasses the whole globe. The surveys also demonstrated the exercise of imperial power on an enormous geographic scale. You know the survey here on Prince Edward Island, but as I'm going to show you, the surveys encompassed an enormous area of the eastern seaboard. And really, I argue in the book that this surveying expedition was a forerunner of the great imperial surveys that the British accomplished around many parts of the world, notably in India and Africa and elsewhere through the 19th and indeed into the early 20th centuries. Well, the origins of the British surveying project begins in the Scottish Highlands, and I'm showing you Paul Samby's well-known watercolour of a surveying team at Loch Rannoch about 1749. As I'm sure many of you know, given your Scottish origins, the Highlands were pacified after Culloden, the defeat of the Jacobites at Culloden in 1746, and the British were determined that there would be no further revolts. And so they pacified the Highlands, disrupting the Highland way of life and sending, of course, Highlanders across the Atlantic to here and elsewhere. And they also wanted military information about the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, and so instituted a great military survey led by William Roy. And this was the beginnings of British military surveying and mapping and the foundations of what we now know as the Ordnance Survey, which is still an arm of the British government. So here is the beginnings of that survey process in the wilds of the Highlands. Now, soon after this survey was started and indeed completed, what the Americans know as the French and Indian War, and what we know as the 7 Years' War, broke out in North America in 1755. And with the outbreak of that war between Britain and its colonies and the French and New France, the British quickly realized that they were short of military intelligence of the terrain they would be fighting in, and indeed of the sea coasts, so they needed military surveys of eastern North America. They didn't have the skilled personnel, they were short of army engineers, and so they did recruiting on the European continent. And that's where our hero enters the story. Samuel Holland, as his name suggests, was from the Netherlands and was a foreign Protestant and recruited into the British Army, as was his later colleague, JFW Dade Barr, who was recruited from Switzerland. They both joined the Royal American Regiment and were shipped out to the arena of conflict. And what I'm showing here in this map are the movements of Samuel Holland in the early part of the war. The headquarters of the British military effort was New York, and so he first went to New York, and it was there that he was entrusted with the important task of pulling together all the cartographic information that was available of the Hudson-Champlain Valley. One of the British prongs of their attack on New France, of course, was up the Hudson-Champlain Valley to Montreal, and they needed the military intelligence of the terrain. And so you can see that there is an arrow going up to Ticonderoga, where Holland surveyed the fortifications. He pulled together the information and created this map, his first map of any part of North America. It doesn't look much like his later scientific maps. He was later embarrassed by this map and its publication in London by Thomas Jeffreys. There are many inaccuracies. He did not have the resources to conduct a scientific survey, and essentially this map is cobbled together from existing cartographic sources. Nevertheless, it was a great advance on what was available. It brought him to the attention of the British military authorities, and he was then sent to Halifax. You see the arrow there, the two arrows, in fact. There was a failed attempt to attack Lewisburg in 1757, and he went back again in 1758 to Halifax. Halifax, the springboard for the attack on Lewisburg on Ile Royale. By this time, he was not only known for his map-making skills, surveying skills, but also for his artillery skills and general awareness of how to bombard a major European fortress. So he goes up with the fleet and the army to Lewisburg, and as you all know, the British are successful in their siege, and during the conflict, he comes to the attention of Brigadier General James Wolfe at that time. In the aftermath of the siege, Holland is instructed to survey the battlefield. And this is his great manuscript map, which is in the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. And it's while doing this survey for this map that he had that famous encounter, what we now see as a very famous encounter, with James Cook, who was on one of the British warships, a master of one of the British warships that was supporting the British forces. And Cook was intrigued by Holland's survey team, and Holland gave him tutorials in surveying. And of course, the rest is history. Cook then went on to become one of the world's most famous explorers and surveyors and map makers. And here he is with his great map of the Southern Ocean. Well, after the capture of Lewisburg in 1758, the British, now under the command of James Wolfe, moved up the St. Lawrence in the summer of 1759, and as we all know, laid siege to Quebec and successfully captured it in September. And here is the British troop transports going up the St. Lawrence as a prelude to the assault on the Plains of Abraham. Montreal was captured the following year. Now, it's important to remember that in 1760, after the capture of Montreal, that no one knew what was going to happen to New France. And the British military authorities thought it was very conceivable that New France would be traded back to the French. As some of you may know, there was discussions of swapping it for Guadeloupe. Guadeloupe, very much more important because of the sugar trade than freezing Canada. That did not happen, but the British authorities did not know that. That was still in the future. And so they were determined to get as much intelligence as they could of the St. Lawrence. So in Murray's terms, if they ever had to do this war again, fight the French again in North America, they would know where things were. So they undertake a survey of Canada. So we've had the survey of Scotland in the late 1740s, early 1750s. We're now having a survey of Canada, and that, of course, is French Canada, New France. And there are a number of surveyors involved, and you can see Holland's name is on this map. There was a certain amount of competition in the survey between Holland and Montresor, who was from the engineers and rather despised Holland. But in fact, Holland won out and won the respect of James Murray, who was now in charge after Wolfe's death. So there was a great survey done, and a series of manuscript maps were produced. And this is one in the Library and Archives Canada, showing the area around Quebec City. And Quebec City is not working, but it's there in the... there we are. There we are. There's Quebec City. And this is a very standard kind of topographic map that the British were producing, and they produced similar maps of the Survey of Scotland, and we're now doing it for the Survey of Canada. Now, Holland minded his P's and Q's, and Montresor rather blotted his copybook on one of these maps, which would have been done by Holland. Montresor, it's reported, scratched out, erased Holland's name, and put his name in instead to get the glory of producing the map. And Murray was not amused, so when the maps were done and had to be sent to London, it was Holland, not Montresor, that was entrusted with taking the maps to London, presenting them to the Prime Minister, to the War Office, and most importantly, to King George. And this, of course, was a great feather in the cap for Holland, and it gets Holland to the seat of imperial power at a very crucial time. So we now have the Survey of Canada, which has been undertaken. Well, peace is signed in 1763, and the peace treaty gave Britain all of North America from the Arctic to the Gulf of Mexico, east of the Mississippi, an enormous territory. A territory that the British didn't know a great deal about, and that they had to develop policy for. So in the fall of 1763, the famous Royal Proclamation was made, which set out the governance of these newly acquired areas. It's a very important policy document setting out the British governing of these immense territories. And Holland is right there in London as this policy is being worked out in the summer of 1763, and it's very clear to the authorities that they need geographic information, and they've got Holland, who's just produced this wonderful survey of Canada right there. He's advising them, and of course he gets tapped for the job. Now there are two agents of the British government that are interested in North America. The first is the Board of Trade, which is the arm of government that is overseeing the colonies. And here is a wonderful illustration of Lord Halifax there on your right, with his two secretaries, Sedgwick and Stanhope. At least one of those names, of course, plus Halifax gets commemorated by Holland here in Prince Edward Island. So the Board of Trade wanted surveys of the new territory. The other arm of government was the Lords of the Admiralty, who wanted a marine or hydrographic survey from Labrador to the Gulf of Mexico. They, of course, would be entrusted in protecting North America from any French or Spanish attack in the future, so they wanted charts of the waters. And it was very clear, of course, in the British assault on Quebec, how much modern charts were needed of the St. Lawrence. So both arms of government institute surveys. This is important to remember. And these operations get going in 1764. The Board of Trade surveys were divided into northern and southern surveys. The largest was led by Samuel Holland in the north, and in the south, Gerhard de Braam was given the task of surveying Florida, east and west Florida, which had been captured from the Spanish and taken over by the British because of the peace treaty. So those are the two areas of surveying, and the intention was to meet at the Potomac. The Potomac was the dividing line, and the two surveys were eventually to meet there. That did not happen, of course. The other part of the surveying was done by the Admiralty, and there were going to be Admiralty surveys of Newfoundland and Labrador by James Cook, and then later by Lane, of Nova Scotia by de Barr, and by Gould in the Gulf of Mexico. So you get a sense of the enormity of these surveys, and you can understand that this Prince Edward Island survey is just one part of this larger surveying enterprise. Well, Holland's survey was the most well-equipped survey to leave Britain before Cook left for the Pacific in 1768. That's all in the future. We now know, of course, that's going to happen, but in 1764, nobody's thinking of sending Cook to the Pacific. So Holland is the man, and he's got the backing and the support, logistical support of the Admiralty and the Board of Trade for this great survey. A vessel was found in the River Thames and outfitted at Deptford, and here is the naval dockyard, a contemporary painting of the dockyard at Deptford, just downriver from the City of London. The ship that was going to be used was the Canso. Fortunately, the Canso, during the surveying, was sent back to Deptford for a refit, and drawings were taken, and these drawings now survive in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, London. So we have the lines taken here. And the Canso was to be the support ship, the depot ship, that would supply the surveyors for many years during their surveys. The actual survey was done from small boats. This is something that's important to realize, that the skipper of the Canso, Henry Mowat, who later become very notorious for burning down Falmouth, later Portland, Maine, is a hated figure in Maine, but Mowat, a naval officer, never wanted to risk the Canso inshore, and so would anchor it in a sheltered harbour, and much of the surveying was done actually from small boats, as you can see from this illustration. We've got a small boat team there and a surveyor in his red coat with his plane table. I think this is somewhere eastern Nova Scotia, perhaps western Cape Breton Island, around Richmond Island, Straits of Canso area that this survey is being undertaken. This is an illustration from the Atlantic Neptune. I like this illustration because it gives you some idea of the enormity of the surveying and the kind of conditions that these men worked in for years and years. We're fortunate that some of the surveying documents have survived, most notably Thomas Wright's notebook, which is here in the archives on the island, and this is a scan of one of the pages, and it shows his triangulation. I think this is Grand River, and the soundings taken from the small boat going up the river. These marine surveys were then fitted into the geodetic survey, and that was done by using sextants and for latitude and for telescopes to establish longitude. We know, because of David Sorbell's work on the problem of longitude, all about Harrison and his chronometer, which I'll come to in a minute. Holland did not have that. So the way they figured out longitude was based on Galileo's figuring out, using a telescope, that the moons of Jupiter provided a celestial timepiece, and that if you timed the immersion and immersion of the satellites, the moons of Jupiter, you could have essentially a clock, and you could time the position of those movements of satellites, of the moons, at your location, and then compare that to another location, the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, and the difference in time would allow you to figure out the distance in degrees and allow you to establish longitude very correctly. The French had already used this actually at Lewisburg. The Cassini famously had done this in France. So this is not something new, but Holland is using it for the survey. And for that, he not only needed telescopes, but also clocks. And this is, of course, a rather famous clock, George Graham's clock, now in the Canadian Museum of Civilization. I believe the clock's visiting Charlottetown this summer as part of the exhibit. And it was the latest timepiece. It was from one of the leading clockmakers in London. So Holland was outfitted with the best equipment, and so he could get it right down to the sort of the second of the circulation of the moons of Jupiter. So here is Harrison holding his famous chronometer, and at this point, when Holland's working, the chronometer's not been finished. It had been finished, but it hadn't been shrunk down to the size shown in Harrison's hand. And in fact, it won't become available until Cook's second voyage to the Pacific, and Cook famously referred to it as his trusted friend. Well, it wasn't available to Holland, so Holland's using this astronomical way of figuring out longitude. So there's a lot of science and technology involved, but there's also local knowledge, local native knowledge. We have this wonderful cartouche that was never published by James Peachey, who was on the survey team, showing Indians in the St. Lawrence. And we know from the records and from the survey accounts that Holland had native guides for much of the survey and was paying them for their work. He also employed Acadian guides in various places. So essentially, local knowledge is being assimilated by the British in this survey and in a sense universalized in the maps that are produced. And in a sense, that native knowledge is no longer of use once it gets incorporated into these texts of maps. But it's absolutely critical for the actual surveying. In fact, there's a sort of interesting incident of Holland surveying the Margaree Valley in Cape Breton, and the natives don't show up with birch-bark canoes, so he never goes up the Margaree to Lake Ainslie. And if you look at his map of Cape Breton, Lake Ainslie is not involved. It is not shown on the map. So there are absences in his surveying, and that reflects often the absence of native peoples and their knowledge. Well, as you know, his survey began here on St. John's Island, and here's a view from taken by Ron Garnett, who used to be in Charlottetown. It's been very helpful to us at the Canadian American Centre. We're looking across the harbour to Fort Amherst, and just in the distance, Observation Cove, just to the right of this picture, where Holland bases his camp and starts the survey. The Canso is moored in the harbour here, sheltered water, and supplies the surveying teams with all their provisions and equipment. The surveys begin in late 1764 and run through into the spring of 1765, and here is a map of the survey teams fanning out across the island. They particularly enjoyed working in the winter when the water bodies and the seacoast was frozen, and they could move around pretty rapidly with snowshoes. And you can see their various movements, and you can see that Holland was an active surveyor at this point of the survey. In the early summer, they bring together their field notes, such as the one I've just shown you by Thomas Wright, and at Observation Cove, they begin to put together their monumental map, which again will be on display at the Confederation Arts Centre this summer. This is actually a reduced copy of that map. I realise I actually have a digital version of the large manuscript map, but it would have taken a lot to tile it all together. So this was a reduced version that was made. It's also in the National Archives in Kew in London. And it's very similar to the large map that will be coming over for display in the summer. So this is a manuscript map, and with the topography drawn, the coastline, and various civil divisions. Based on that manuscript map, an engraved map is produced in London, which we have on display here, published in 1775, and so we start to get Holland's information put into circulation. As you can see clearly from this map, and as you all know, Holland lays out the major civil divisions, the 3 counties, the parishes, the townships, and names principal towns, Georgetown, Princetown, and Charlottetown, and many other towns. And he's following the Board of Trade instructions. This is important to remember. He had very specific instructions, and he's following them as best as he can in the division of land on the island. The cadastral pattern still marks the island today. This is a photograph I took on a flight from London to Boston, about 35,000 feet, looking over Princes County. There's the Confederation Bridge in the left, and various lines. I was looking at it closely on the computer this afternoon, and I assure you, if you do match it up to the map, there are various sort of county road lines that do follow his survey, and of course many property lines are based on those baselines that Holland drew for the townships and the counties, and it's a very distinctive cadastral pattern. He also named much of the island, which I found fascinating. There's been a lot of interest, scholarly interest, in Cook's naming of New Zealand and Australia. Think Sydney, think Botany Bay, Cloudy Bay in New Zealand, etc., etc. But Holland was before Cook, and really had a tabula rasa. I think he had this manuscript map laid out in his tent at Observation Cove, and decided how, a process of naming, which I go into some detail in the book. And there's obviously a hierarchy of names that he creates with Prince, Queens, and Kings County. He's honouring royalty. He's also honouring his patrons in England, notably Halifax, and also the Duke of Richmond, who had helped recruit Holland into the Royal American Regiment at the beginning of the 7 Years' War. So he felt very beholden to the Duke of Richmond and Lennox, and here are some of those names, and the concentration of Richmond names in the top left are now Richmond Bay. You also see Halifax and Hillsborough and Harrington, Cardigan, many of these names, of course, familiar to you. And here is Richmond Bay with Lennox Island shown in the picture. So Richmond was the Duke of Richmond and Lennox. And just personally, his house is just outside Chichester in West Sussex. And I went to school in Chichester, Goodwood House. So I sort of felt a bit of a connection to Richmond, and did inquire with the archivist for the Duke of Richmond whether any of Holland's considerable correspondence to the Duke survived, and unfortunately hadn't. And I think the reason is that the Duke also, that was his country house at Goodwood, he also had a townhouse in London, Richmond House, and that house unfortunately burnt down, and I suspect the correspondence between Holland and the Duke went up in flames. So we don't have that connection. But we do know that Holland was sending copies of his maps to the Duke as sort of recognition of his patronage and getting him started in his British Army career. There's also recognition of his military comrades, particularly his commanders. So we've got Wolfe at one end of the island, Murray at the other, and various lords of the Admiralty and captains and army officers such as Carleton. And here is Cape Wolfe at the western end of the island, and Murray Harbour, or part of Murray Harbour, on the eastern end. So these names, again, all familiar to you, but all put in place by Holland during his laying out of names on the map. You also, of course, well know that Holland, there was a lottery of land after the map was created. There was a lottery of land on the island, and Holland put in for the draw and got lot 28 shown on this map. He was disappointed with it because he wanted a map on the Gulf side because he figured that would be well situated for the fishery. So he was a bit disappointed. But nevertheless, I want to emphasize that Holland's land holdings, although well known here, were just one part of the land holdings that he accumulated and acquired during his surveying operations. Governor Wentworth of New Hampshire was generous to him at that point. Part of Vermont was under his jurisdiction, and so you see those connections, those land holdings there in New Hampshire and what is Vermont today. And these were land holdings that Holland acquired, and there were good land holdings in the Connecticut River there, but unfortunately he lost them during the American Revolution. After the St. John survey was completed, he moved over to Cape Breton Island and was based in Lewisburg. And fortunately, we have a surviving illustration showing one of the small survey vessels, the Venus sloop, which is on the far left of this illustration. I think this is again by Wright. And you see the destroyed walls of Lewisburg, and as I say, the Venus sloop, which is about to go off and do surveying around the island. The survey was based there for one season, and then they went out into the Gulf of St. Lawrence to survey really right up to Quebec City, where the survey of Canada had finished. That's a solid line. And so just an immense amount of surveying is being done, principally by his deputy surveyors. By this point, Holland's getting tired, and so he has property in Quebec City and at Saint Foy, and his family is there, and so he likes his creature comforts, and the deputies are all sent into the wilds of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, particularly along that Labrador shore, to survey. So in an immense operation. Again, we've got a watercolour done by Peachy, several watercolours, and this is just one of them, giving you a sense of the immensity of the terrain. Some of you, of course, know the lower St. Lawrence, and here this wonderful illustration downriver from Quebec City of the terrain that is being surveyed. Well, the other part of this story is de Barr, also an army officer, and very quickly the Admiralty give him the task to survey Nova Scotia. He's based in Halifax and spends several years surveying coasts of Nova Scotia and Sable Island, He does not have a large ship like the Canso. He has schooners such as this one. This is a late 18th century model in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, the kind of vessel that he used. And we have this delightful illustration of de Barr on Sable Island with its massive sand dunes. And I think this has to be de Barr in the red coat on the left here. And it's, of course, a very windy place, and the team are trying to pitch their tents here, and it's all blowing around and a bit chaotic. Well, de Barr and Holland are in correspondence, and they actually meet when Holland is relocating from Quebec City to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And they meet in Liverpool, Nova Scotia, and quite fortuitously, Simeon Perkins recorded the meeting in his diary. One of the great treasures, of course, of Nova Scotian history is Simeon Perkins' diary. And, of course, Simeon Perkins' house still exists, and they had drinks here with Simeon Perkins, the leading merchant in Liverpool. And it's there that de Barr and Holland agree to share their surveys with a view to them being published. And Holland then starts to supply de Barr with his manuscripts that de Barr will later engrave and publish in London to great acclaim. Holland then moves on to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where he's based for several years, and the survey teams fan out again to survey the Gulf of Maine, and particularly the Maine Coast, which is an enormous task. De Barr complained about Nova Scotia, but I think even Nova Scotia pales compared to the complexities of the Maine Coast, which really drove the surveyors mad and took them several years to pull the surveys together. And when that was done, they went south around Cape Cod, as you can see, and into Long Island Sound. However, as these surveys are pushing south to the Cape, the American Revolution is starting to break out, and Holland has to leave Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where he had benefited from the patronage of Governor Wentworth, and he relocates to Perth Amboy, just near New York City. And if you remember that map I showed you of the Hudson Valley that he did at the beginning of his career, Holland was now back in New York, and he was determined to fix that map. But all he managed to do was to create this little inset map, which I'm showing you on the screen, which on later editions of that map is shown in the top left corner. And it's really of the area around his house. In fact, Holland's house is shown on the map. It's called Holland's house. It's just here. And really the survey team could only go a few hundred yards from the house for fear of risking their lives, because the whole countryside was now up in arms. Holland was being threatened, and he didn't stay there long, and in fact fled to safety to a British warship in New York Harbour, which took him back to England in December 1775. He returns to England. Well, by that point, de Barr had already moved back to London, and he was busy lobbying the great and the good for support to publish his charts and those of Holland. And you have to remember, at this point, there is no official government agency for publishing or engraving and publishing maps and charts in Britain. It's still done in sort of the private realm. And so de Barr has to find the financial support and the patrons for this immense publishing project. And so he starts to look for support. Here is Admiral Lord Howe, who was fully supportive. I feel a certain sort of kindred spirit to Howe because of my time at the University of British Columbia. And if you know the UBC campus will know at the end of the mile you look straight across to Howe Sound, which is named after this man by Captain George Vancouver when he was later surveying the coast of British Columbia. Howe is soon to get the command of the British Navy in North American waters. So clearly Howe wants the latest charts. So he's supportive. And then de Barr lobbies the other important government official, and that, of course, is John Montagu, the Earl of Sandwich, who's the First Lord of the Admiralty. And this is a very sympathetic portrait of sandwich done by Thomas Gainsborough. It's in the Cook Museum in Whitby in Yorkshire in England. Sandwich, of course, is famous for many things. He was a great gambler and womanizer, but it's also reputed that when he worked late at the Admiralty, he would demand a steak and would slap that steak between two slices of bread, giving rise to the sandwich. Well, in the late 18th century, as I say, the Admiralty didn't have a hydrographic office, so the Admiralty support, represented by Sandwich, was crucial. And Sandwich gets a government appropriation to finance the engraving and publication of the charts. And de Barr is in the thick of, he's in Soho, in the thick of the sort of Huguenot skilled craft area, and I think hires some of the very best engravers in London. And so when you see the Atlantic Neptune charts and see the title pages, you know you're looking at something very special. This is one of the title pages. It's just a spectacular piece of engraving typography. I rather feel that the charts in the Atlantic Neptune just beat Cook's completely. I mean, Cook's famous, of course, for his charts in New Zealand, Australia, Tahiti, Hawaii, etc. But they're not as well done if you compare them side by side with the ones that de Barr and Holland produced. Didn't quite have the skill and artistic accomplishment. This bar graph shows the imprint dates of the charts, and there's a demonstration one done in 1774. The American Revolution breaks out in 1775, and you can see just the tremendous pressure on de Barr to publish the charts. So there's a great outpouring in 1776, and then it sort of tails off during the course of the war. One of the very first charts is this one of Boston, which the British hold until they evacuate it. And the commander-in-chief, the naval commander, was desperate to get this one because, as you can see from the islands, Boston was a difficult port to enter. So eventually the charts encompass much of the eastern seaboard from Labrador down to the Gulf of Mexico. Some of de Brahm's and Gould's charts were also incorporated into the Atlantic Neptune. So on the left side you can see some of the small-scale charts, and then on the right-hand side the large-scale charts, particularly Gulf of St. Lawrence, Nova Scotia, and the Gulf of Maine. The charts are in extraordinary detail. I'm picking out the one of two of Prince Edward Island. So this is obviously the entrance into Hillsborough Bay and into the harbour at Charlottetown. And as you can see from the legend, from the title, it's based on Holland's survey. De Barr did, in fact, acknowledge Holland in this survey. Interestingly, he did not produce a map of Prince Edward Island. I think it's because we'd already had the engraved one, had come out in 1775. There was no need to repeat that one, this one here. So we just have these two details, and then another map that has PEI and Pictou County and Cape Breton on one chart. And then at a larger scale, we get this kind of map produced. This is of Nova Scotia. And I should point out the banks of Nova Scotia are being picked out by de Barr's naval skipper, Lieutenant John Knight, who did a sterling job in sounding the sea bottom while de Barr was doing the coastline. And then finally, this really epic chart of the northeast from the Delaware up to basically Battle Harbour in Labrador, an astonishing piece of work. And as you can see from both the Nova Scotia chart I've just shown you and this one and the one here on display, they look like modern maps. So these were done because they'd figured out how to measure latitude and longitude and to fit it into this larger graticule, which is shown on the map here. Well, just a few summary comments. It's really an extraordinary scientific achievement, done under very difficult conditions. a good part of the surveys were undertaken in wilderness with extreme climate and weather, particularly the ones in this part of the world. Holland really wrote about the difficult conditions here on the island, and then also in the survey of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. There was very little support. A few British troops at Fort Amherst, Fort Beauséjour, and then the next garrisons in Quebec City. So we're dealing with a vast area with very little support, except what could be provided by the Canso. The surveys and mapping marked the beginning of scientific mapping on a large scale of the continent. And many of these maps would not be superseded until American and British coastal surveys in the early 19th century, most notably in this part of the world by Banfield. They also had an important influence on the Pacific surveys. The Admiralty, in the course of running these operations, realized that they couldn't have surveys where you had Army surveyors, Samuel Holland, J.F.W. de Barr, on naval ships. Actually, right at the beginnings of Holland's survey, there's a conflict between Holland and Mowat about who's in charge. Clearly, this is not the way to run a survey, to have two different arms of the military involved. And so it's really interesting that when Cook gets the job, he's not only a naval officer who can command a ship, but he's a trained surveyor. And so that's the beginning of that naval surveying tradition. Before that, they're relying on army surveyors. So it's a very important sort of change in British approach to these surveys conducted thousands of miles away from Britain. The surveys also pointed to the lack of a hydrographic office in London. And so this was eventually addressed with the establishment of the Hydrographic Office in 1795, the beginnings of the very famous Admiralty charts that covered the globe, and indeed the first naval director of the Hydrographic Office was Thomas Hurd, who had served as a midshipman on the Canso. So he'd cut his teeth commanding one of those small boat crews that were taking Holland survey teams around the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the Gulf of Maine. So there's a direct connection into the later history of the Hydrographic Office. The surveys also point out how Imperial Britain was beginning to rearrange the world around London. The use of the Greenwich meridian for marking longitude, of course, and this was first used in these North American surveys. But the surveys also show the shortcomings of the imperial state. Although Britain was the leading scientific power in the world in the late 18th century, policymakers, even faced with the breakdown of law and order in the American colonies, beginning very early with the Stamp Act crisis of 1765, steadfastly refused to redirect the surveys to mapping land. There's a marvelous letter from General Gage in New York, who's responsible for the British Army in the colonies, who's got to restore order during the Stamp Act riots. He writes to Holland saying, and Holland's in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, he says to Holland, look, when you finish there, come and survey the interior of these colonies because we need the maps. But unfortunately, that never happens, and Holland just continues doing his coastal surveys. So when the revolution broke out in 1775, the British had some magnificent maps of the eastern seaboard, as you can see from this illustration, but very poor coverage of the interior, as they soon found at Lexington and Concord. However, the surveys did leave a permanent mark on some parts of the eastern seaboard, most especially here in Prince Edward Island, the most appropriate place to commemorate the start of this great survey. Thank you.